Good day to you. I'm terribly sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I'm grateful for being given this opportunity to at least address you through this video presentation. And in this presentation, I'm essentially going to rely on some of the major findings of the IPCC fourth assessment report, wherein not only would I be showing you some of the observations related to climate change through the presentation that I make, but also make some projections about the future. I want to compliment you on organizing this important meeting. Let me start with the first slide, which essentially says that warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Now, this is based on observations, and this is a simple, but I would say a very eloquent statement. In other words, there really is no space left for any scientific doubt on the fact that our climate is changing. And it's also true, as we have brought out in the fourth assessment report, that over the last 50 years, most of the changes that have taken place are the result of increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. And those greenhouse gases and their increase are essentially the result of human activities. I turn now to the next slide. This slide gives you observed changes that have taken place since the beginning of industrialization. And as you would observe in the very first picture that you see over here, which shows global average temperature changes, clearly there is no linear pattern to these changes. There are ups and downs, there are fluctuations in this temperature, which are essentially the result of both natural as well as human-induced changes that have taken place over time. Nature, through its various mechanisms, also influences the climate year to year and over a much longer period of time as well. And this is the result of solar activity or volcanic activity. But what you observe over here is that in the last 5 decades or so, essentially the trend is upward. And that is largely the result of increase in what we call anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. If you look at the second diagram, you see increase in sea levels. And just to give you a quantitative indication of changes that have taken place, in the last century, the increase in global average temperature has been about 0.74 degrees Celsius. But as far as the increase in sea level is concerned, it has been about 17 centimeters, which is quite considerable, because if you're living in a low-lying coastal area or in a small island state, then clearly 17 centimeters represents a very serious problem for those living in these locations. The third of these diagrams gives you the changes in snow cover in the northern hemisphere. And we're taking the northern hemisphere because essentially that's where most of the land area of this planet actually lies. I turn to the next slide now, and this gives you changes in global average temperature, which is essentially an elaboration of the first diagram that you saw in the previous slide. If you look at the trend, and that you would get once we look at the line drawn across the last 100 years or so of temperature changes, that gives you the 0.74 degree increase in temperature. But if you look at the last 50 years, the line is substantially steeper, and therefore you can conclude that the climate is changing much more rapidly now than was the case, let's say, 100 years ago. We also know that in the last 12 years, 11 of those years have been the warmest in recorded history. We have also come to the conclusion that extreme precipitation events are on the increase across the globe, and they are likely to get progressively worse over a period of time unless we do something about stabilizing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. An example is what really happened in Mumbai in 2005. We know what's happening in Pakistan right now with a massive flood. We know the cloudburst that took place in Ladakh, causing substantial damage. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that these single occurrences or events were the result of human-induced climate change, but I think we can expect that these are likely to increase over a period of time, both in frequency and intensity. And I think the world will have to adapt to this set of occurrences unless we do something about mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases and thereby stabilizing the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere. Mountain glaciers and snow cover have declined across all continents, and this is something that I mentioned earlier, but I'd like to emphasize it by showing you these two photographs which are very revealing. Next slide, please. Now, we have come to the conclusion that continued emissions of greenhouse gases would induce many changes in the global climate system during the 21st century. And chances are that these changes will be far more serious and much more severe than what we have seen in the 20th century. This is a finding that we have brought out very clearly, and therefore I think global society has to be aware of the growing seriousness of the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. What we see over here is the increase in carbon dioxide emissions, which, as you would observe, for a fairly long period of time have remained quite stable. But what we find is a sudden spike in recent decades. And those of you who've seen the film An Inconvenient Truth by Mr. Al Gore would remember that to emphasize how steep the latter few years of increase in carbon dioxide emissions are in the case of this diagram, he actually mounted an elevator and went all the way up to the top of this diagram. The important thing to remember is that since 1970, there has been a 70% increase in the emissions of greenhouse gases. This, in some sense, seems very irresponsible on the part of global society, because on the one hand, in 1992, we came up with the Framework Convention on Climate Change, but its implementation has been largely ineffective, as is clearly demonstrated by the fact that emissions have continued to increase despite an agreement by global society to try and manage this problem and reduce emissions.